In today's demo, I'm making a copy of one of Joseph Clement Cole's illustrations for the Lost World. Joseph Clement Cole was a Golden Age illustrator, and I've always been fascinated by that whole era. I love the artwork that was produced then, and Joseph Clement Cole was a master of pen and ink work. There were other fantastic inkers as well. Charles Dana Gibson, James Montgomery Flagg, just many, many others. But what's interesting is for such a ubiquitous technique and media that was used just by almost everyone during that era, I guess once photography came along, it really dropped out of the mix and is really not practiced anymore. Now, there are, of course, people who use pen and ink, and people in the comic book industry, of course, but they really don't use the same techniques that the Golden Age illustrators used, mostly because they know that their inking is just the foundation on which a colorist is going to come by later and color on top of, so they don't have to worry about trying to produce atmospheric effects and things like that. But the Golden Age illustrators, well, they didn't have that, so they knew that if they wanted to produce a moody effect or atmospheric effect or something like that, they had to do it with just what they had, either a brush or a nib of some sort. Now, you'll see that through a lot of what I'm doing, I'm using a brush, and some of it I don't think Cole used the brush as much as I'm doing. I'm just trying to make my hand as sensitive as possible and have as light a touch as possible, because you can create incredibly thin lines with a brush, as thin as you can with a Coll pen or some other nib as well. But you just want to be able, I want to be able to use both. So in some of these that when I'm copying and practicing, I will use the brush as much as I can and then turn to the pen later. Now, the materials I'm using are, well, the paper, first of all, is Strathmore Bristol board, 100-pound paper. If you're going to do pen and ink, especially with a Coll pen or any sort of nib, you just want to make sure that it's a tough enough paper that it can take the scratching, because nibs will tear up paper really quickly. And you also want to make sure that it's a heavy enough paper that it won't just bleed through and bloom all over the place. I do a lot of inking just on regular printing paper, the kind you get 500 sheets for a few bucks. But you really can't do a lot of sensitive inking. The paper just won't hold up to it. Now, as I'm working, again, since there's really no one teaching it, I'm having to really look and concentrate and think, well, now, how did he lay this line down, and how did he position his arm? How was he holding the brush? Things like that. And you'll begin to learn as you do something like this very quickly that if you're not getting the same results that you feel like the master did, then very possibly you're doing something wrong, like holding the brush wrong, or possibly using the wrong brush, wrong nib. Now, talking about the materials I'm using, for the brush, I'm using a Raphael, looking at the numbers here, I think it's a 8404 Kolinsky Sable. I bought quite a few back before they started embargoing them. I don't know that you can even buy them anymore. They're relatively expensive because they were true Kolinsky hair. really nice brushes. They get just needlepoint sharp tips, and real versatile. Have a lot of spring to them. That's what's nice about natural hair brushes, is that they have a far superior spring to them than synthetic brushes, at least in my experience. I don't use it in this particular demo, but I also have one of Pentel's I can't think of what it's called. Okay, I use sometimes the Pentel Pocket Brush. I like it because it's refillable, and you can carry it out in the field if you want to. Of course, dip pens and brushes you really can't do out of the studio. It's just too inconvenient, too messy, and too rife with the possibility of disaster. So, definitely you'd want to use a dip pen or something like that, or not a dip pen, but a brush pen that you can fill up with ink, and it's just got its own little reservoir. Interestingly enough, the Pentel pen is actually quite nice. It's not very expensive, less than $20, or about $20, and has a really nice fine point for a synthetic. The one thing a lot of people don't like about dip brushes is just that, dipping over and over again, because it does take time. You stop what you're doing, you reach over and dip your pen and clean it off. I agree, and a lot of times I don't want to fool with it. It's a distraction. But other times, a dip pen or dipping a brush is actually very conducive to what I'm trying to do, because it forces you to stop and kind of take a breath for a second. So you're not just sitting there just brushing and doing it mindlessly. You're brushing, and then all of a sudden you stop for a minute and you have to dip your brush and clean it off. And in that time, you take your eyes off your drawing for a minute, you take a breath, and you look back, and a lot of times you realize, I don't need to work in this area anymore. It's getting ready to be overworked. Just taking that break for 1 second gives you enough time to look back with a bit of a fresh eye. It can also keep you from getting fatigued, because you're changing what your muscles are doing for just that couple of seconds. But either way you want to go is fine. Now, one thing I have to say about the inks, if you are planning on doing a wash or anything over your pen and ink work, then you want to consider using a shellac-based ink, because doing a wash over your inks, you can cause them to reanimate, I guess, and bleed and run all over the place. Now, I've used inks that I've used Higgins Eternal ink and inked up a drawing, painted right on top of it, watercolor painted on top of it, and if you're careful and you don't go overboard, then it'll work okay. But you do run the risk of contaminating your colors and making your drawing run and soften up. So if you're going to do any sort of washing, I would then consider just using a dipping ink. And I've used Higgins's Black Magic, and right now what I'm using here is Sumi ink. It comes in the green bottle. It's nice. It's Yasutomo's Black Sumi ink. And, you know, you can get online and different forums, and some people will rant and rave about one, and some people will praise another. I would suggest buying both. They're not that expensive, and try them. Definitely, the Sumi ink is thicker, has a thicker consistency. I think it's a little blacker, but I think they both work fine. I wouldn't sweat using either one of them. And again, what they have is a shellac in the ink, so that when you put it down, once it dries, that shellac hardens up, and at least in theory, you can't lift it up with water again. So once it's down, it's down. You do want to be particularly careful with your brushes. If you use these shellac-based inks, then you want to clean your brushes really well at the end of the day. I go in with soap and water regardless of what ink or what paint I use. I go in and I wash my brushes with soap and water every single session, because again, a lot of these brushes are really expensive, $20, $25 a piece, and if you take care of a brush, it'll last you a long time. And it doesn't take that shellacked ink but one time to dry in your brush, and now you've ruined it. So I suggest you be really, really careful with them, and they'll serve you for a long, long time. Now, as far as replacing the natural hair brushes, I don't know. I bought quite a few back in the day, and so they'll last me for a while, and I guess I'll have to look at someone else's YouTube videos and their reviews and see what they think about what brushes are good to replace the sable hairs. Like I said, I couldn't tell you. I do have some synthetics, and I don't remember which ones I've got because I don't use them for this very often. I didn't care for them. I didn't feel like they were as responsive. They didn't have the spring. They didn't seem to go to a point as well. But oddly enough, like I said, the Pentel pocket brush actually has done a really, really good job. It was very remarkable that such a relatively inexpensive brush that's all synthetic would work as well as it did, and still does. But I think mine's beginning to wear out a little bit, and I'll have to replace it. But if I had to, if I was going to go to something synthetic, I'd use those Pentels. Now, you will notice that the drawing that I did is with green pencil. And the reason that it's green is, well, one, I have a lot of green pencils. I had some order that got messed up, and so instead of ordering 4 pencils, I wound up ordering 4 boxes. And I didn't want to send them back, so I kept them. But I have a lot of colored pencils, and if it wasn't that I had all that many greens, then I'd use blue or red or purple. It really wouldn't matter. But if you're going to do inking, I don't suggest you're using graphite of any sort, because it gets really hard to tell what you've inked and what's still penciled. And having a nice sort of bright color down there like this green or a red magenta or whatever, it really stands out, and you know exactly what you've inked, and you don't run the risk of getting confused and thinking, oh, I've already inked that area, and then you grab your eraser and you start erasing out, and you realize, oh my goodness, I just erased that reference area. Which, I mean, it wouldn't be tragic. You could, if you drew it once, you can draw it again, but why would you want to? So at least at this part of the video, you can see that I've swapped over, and I'm using a nib now. The nib I'm using, it's probably a zebra nib. I've got several different kinds that were bought as calligraphy nibs, very flexible but sharp, needle sharp. So again, you'll want to be careful with your paper because these things will just slice through paper very, very quickly. But I really like the zebra nibs and I'd have to look it up. Let's see if I can find it here. See which one I've got. Takikawa. And that's actually probably what I'm using there. And it's just in a cheap plastic calligraphy pen. Nothing special about it. If you want, you could go out and buy some really expensive calligraphy pen handle if you want to. I don't suggest it. It would just be spending money to spend money as far as I can tell, because I've had some of them, and then I've had these cheap plastic ones that you can get at Hobby Lobby for like 50 cents. And they work just fine. But your nibs, that's a different story. You really want to get a really good nib, and something that's flexible and has like the brush, a lot of spring to it. So I suggest getting a Takigawa or a zebra nib, something like that. Don't skimp on that, because again, they're not even that expensive. They're just a few dollars a piece. And one myth that I want to dispel is you'll hear people talk about that they're so afraid of pen and ink because once you put it down, it's down. There's no forgiveness, and it's totally uncorrectable. And if any of you've listened to any of my watercolor tutorials, you'll know that I just really come down hard on people who talk that way, because it's so funny. People try to scare other people. I'm not sure why, because I've said in my other videos that watercolor is incredibly repairable and fixable. There's a dozen ways to alter a watercolor painting once you put the paint down. So, if you want to learn some of those, you can go to some of my watercolor tutorials. But with pen and ink, now true, especially with the shellac ink, once you put it down, it is down. It's can be hard to try to lift it up. Although I will say, if you use the non-shellac ink, those things will actually erase. If you use a really heavy-duty, robust paper, you can use a sort of a harder rubber eraser, and you can actually erase it. I'm not talking about a huge area. I'm talking about individual lines, but you can very often just erase them away. I don't suggest that, because the easiest way is to use acrylic paint and just paint over any mistakes you've made. I wouldn't use whiteout. A lot of comic book artists will use, the old whiteout that we used to use on typewriters. I don't like them because, well, one, they're not archival. They turn yellow real quickly, and I think they turn hard and brittle as well. But you can use acrylic, either use a brush, or, as you'll see me in a little bit, you can buy these Montana markers that are refillable, and or you can just buy a Montana acrylic white marker, and I'm sure it's great paint, but I've used the refillable ones, and I usually use golden acrylics. So I just pour my golden acrylic paint into them and use that, and you can make white lines and correct mistakes, or if you're trying to do white lines within a dark background, instead of trying to paint around all of the white, little bitty white marks, just paint a dark field and then use that Montana marker to just make your white lines. And once you put them down, if for whatever reason you don't like it, just ink right back on top of it. I have done areas where I've made real mistakes, and I've really had to put on a lot of acrylic paint, many layers, to cover up what I had done. Well, as soon as it dried, and dried really well, I just went on top of it with the ink, and if I didn't like that, then I would let it dry, put white paint over it, ink it again, almost doing it like a painting instead of a drawing, really treating it like a painting with layers, where I would put something down. If I don't like it, put some acrylic paint on it, re-ink it. If I don't like it, do it again. Nobody tells you that. I don't hear anybody, even really good inkers, who talk about just putting down white acrylic paint and working right on top of it. Again, it's like so many people want to scare everybody into avoiding a medium because it's so unforgiving or whatever. And it's just been my experience that that all of the mediums have a way of being corrected. You just have to know how. And then you have to know that if you have corrected it, what steps do you have to take later? Because obviously inking on top of acrylic paint is not going to be the same as inking on top of paper. So you just want to be aware of that. But by all means, just have you some white acrylic paint. If you make a mistake, paint over it. Now, I will tell you that if you do paint over it, it's better to go layers than try to go impasto, because what will happen is if you go impasto, then you've got all of these thick textures you've got to deal with. And trying to ink, especially if you're using a sharp nib, it'll be writing over those bits of texture, and it's almost like trying to ink craters of the moon. It just, you're bouncing around, and it takes a lot of your control away from you. So you'll want to be patient, and remember, we have blow dryers, so you can put down a layer, blow it dry, put down another layer, blow it dry. And if you have to do that 3 or 4 times, okay, that's not a problem. Especially, if you're blowing it dry, you're talking about just a few minutes of your time. You got a nice, smooth surface that you can work on, and then you just go back on top of it, no problem. So, main thing is, I just don't want you to be afraid of this medium. It is different. It's very different than what most of us are used to, but it's such a rewarding, beautiful medium that I just hate that not that many people are using it anymore. Now, one of the ways that I like to approach inking is I don't like doing kind of light to dark. I'm not sure that that's a really good technique to use for at least this kind of inking. what I prefer to do is to block in my largest, fairly blackest areas first and give me something to then hatch into. By establishing those shadows, those darks, you've got some form that's already been described. And once, you got your white paper, you've got, for your highlight, you've got your dark blacks for your shadows. Now all you're doing is using your hatch work to link the two together. And so it's kind of easy to form that transition from light to dark if you've already got the dark there. But people who are especially real heavy into doing cross-hatching, where they might, I'm thinking from the 1960s, 70s illustrator Murray Tinkleman, had a really unique style, very mechanical. I like the look of it. I would never want to do it. It to me would just be mind numbing. I don't have that kind of patience, but he would have to build up his form by laying in a series of, say, horizontal lines for one value, and then go back on top of it with vertical lines, and then go back on top of it with diagonal lines one way, then another way. And so it'd be slowly building up. And for me, I think that would make it a lot of times really hard to judge your values, be able to know when to start and when to stop. I suspect that probably somebody like that, he would be mapping out all of his values very precisely. So he would have a drawing that would actually look almost kind of like a paint by numbers, maybe, where everything was already mapped out so that it would be real easy to see where his transition areas were. And I just wouldn't want to do that. Again, nothing wrong with it. If that's what you're drawn to, then absolutely go for it. But for me, I'd rather use a brush, really block in very quickly my darkest darks, and then I've got those two shapes, my extreme light, my extreme dark, that now I can start hatching into and give a bridge between the two and have them relate to one another. Now, the other thing you'll notice if you study the Golden Age pen and ink masters is that they didn't do a lot of cross-hatching. Now, that doesn't mean they did not ever do cross-hatching, but what they tended to do was use thickness of line and the proximity of line. So they would have thick and thin lines to describe value, but they would also use techniques where they would have lines real close together to give the idea of a gray, or they would separate them and have the lines wide apart for a lighter gray. So they were relying on that as opposed to X and cross-hatching everything. One of the things that did was that created a better flow, a more dynamic flowing movement to their drawings. The one thing about cross-hatching is it just tends to be so weighty and so solid, because those multiple X's, they stop you in your tracks. When you're looking around, all of a sudden all those cross-hatching lines, they really grab your attention and they don't want to let you go. Whereas you look at, this Joseph Clement Cole drawing that I'm copying, you'll notice that within all of the figures, he's using the lines usually to go along the line of action. And so he can get a real flow for the characters, a lot of movement in the characters that you wouldn't get if he did a preponderance of cross-hatching. He also would pick times when he's going against the form as opposed to with the form. So you'll have some instances where he might be hatching, say, across the form to describe the volume, and then other times he will hatch with the form to describe movement. So if you look at the front figure, you've got his leg that's under the table. He's going against the form, so he's using those lines to describe the roundness of the leg. But then in other places, he'll be going with the form, say in the arm, sometimes in the leg, and he's making decisions back and forth as to when it's better to go with the form and describe movement, and when it's better to go against the form and describe volume. And I suspect that, I actually know it's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong way of doing it. It's just that you've got to stay consistent with it, and you've got to be doing it for a reason. So you're not just arbitrarily hatching in one direction, then hatching in another. It's a thoughtful process. You're thinking, maybe I've been going with the form for a while, and because I wanted that form perhaps to have more solidity, whereas a little bit later you'll go, I want this form to have more movement. I want the eye to flow across the object that I'm inking much more quickly. So in that instance, then you'd ink with the form. And you can tell throughout this video that, like right now, that I've picked up my Montana pen, and I didn't care for what I had done, so I painted it out with that pen. And I blow dried it and worked right on top of it. And if you make it all the way through, you'll see that I probably do that 2 or 3 times, because a lot of times veering away from exactly the way Coll did it and experimenting, or I've just made a mistake. I've just my lines didn't work the way I wanted them to. They're not looking the way he did it, so I just paint over it and let it dry and ink right on top of it. No harm, no foul. Again, I tell people in most all of my tutorials and in any classes that I teach, you really want to have fun with this. This can be very hard. It can be very taxing physically and mentally, especially when you're doing something like this where you don't have someone to look over your shoulder and say, oh, no, that's not how you do it. Let me show you how you do it, and save you a lot of time and effort. Well, if you don't have that, then you've got to, just get in a state of mind that, okay, look, I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to figure it out. And making mistakes are just stepping stones to success. That's literally all mistakes are when you're dealing with learning a technique. You're just taking one step at a time onto a little stepping stone, and if that stepping stone isn't right, then you move to the next one. And each one should help you progress a little further down the road. You get a little better and a little better. Like I say, I'm in the midst of copying quite a few of these. If you're trying to learn something this kind of technique that's this complex, doing one copy it's going to teach you, but it's probably not going to give you nearly the amount of knowledge you need to really feel confident, like you've got a real handle on it, that you've begun to master it. So you're going to want to probably copy quite a few. That's what I'm doing, and I'm picking and choosing. I'm looking for things that are different in each picture. So I'll have some like this one of three men in suits. Then I've copied one of a woman in a real complex lacy dress. I'll do some with women with long hair. Do animals. Do furniture. Do interiors. Do landscapes. That way you don't run into a situation where you're drawing and you're feeling confident because you've done a lot of figures and you feel really good with the figure, but then all of a sudden you start trying to draw, an interior with a couch and cushions and a vase of flowers behind it, and you're not exactly sure where to go with that. It's got a different pattern. It's got a different texture. Or you're looking at a room with a different lighting. So you that's the other thing. You want to do things with different lighting. So you want to do stuff that's real harsh lighting with strong shadows so that you can really see the form. But then you want to do stuff where it's overcast or foggy, very moody, so that you've got these real subtle changes of value, real soft, subtle gradations. And the best way to do that is, again, to look and see, well, now, how did Christie handle it? How did Howard Chandler Christie? How did Charles Dana Gibson do it? And once you've done that enough, then you've experienced multiple subjects under multiple lighting conditions, and now you've got something in your head that you can remember and draw off of. It just occurred to me, if you look at Japanese and Chinese calligraphy drawings, this is how they've been doing it for a couple of thousand years, where if you come in and you want to be a master calligrapher or a master sumi brush painter, then you copy exactly how your master did it, who copied how his master did it. And now you've picked up that visual language that has evolved over, in their case, millennia. And you've got something you can sort of sink your teeth into and use as a springboard to then launch your own technique. I'm in no wise trying to say that you should just simply be a copyist and never innovate. On the contrary, I love the different techniques of, I keep naming different people like Heinrich Kley, who is a German illustrator, and he has more of a scribbly technique, which I really, really like. And I tend to be that way. When I'm doing my own, I tend to have that sort of scribbly technique. And that's one reason why I'm studying more controlled brush and ink users like Joseph Clement Cole. But Coll is not as controlled as Ralph Dana Gibson. Ralph Dana Gibson was very structured and very controlled. You really didn't see a lot of scribbly techniques with his. What I like about Coll's is he's sort of a bridge between the two. It's sort of like a happy medium between Heinrich Clay and Gibson. It's not to say I won't copy some of theirs. It's just this was a nice piece to transition between the two. You can see here where I go in and use the blow dryer and correct mistakes and then go back and ink on top of it. Well, I think that's about all I've got to say on the subject right now. I'm doing others, and I may post another one where we'll talk through the same thing again. But the main thing is I just wanted to let you guys see one of the things that I'm working on in between projects and let you see that I'm still learning. And I would encourage you to do the same thing as well. Always be a student. I don't care how good you've gotten in a particular medium, you can always do better. And one of the things that will make you better is to experiment with a different medium. It will start taxing muscles that you don't normally use. Think of it like a weightlifter. If a weightlifter does nothing but curls all the time, well, they'll have huge biceps, but their triceps won't be particularly well developed, so they need to do push-ups or overhead lifts. I can't even think what they're called. I haven't lifted weights since I was a kid. Presses of some sort, like bench presses or things like that. A weightlifter wants to have a well-rounded body, and you as an artist, you want to have a well-rounded technique and language in your art. And if you're really, really comfortable in, say, oil or watercolor or something like that, try something really completely different like pen and ink, because it will help you look at trying to render form, trying to render texture and atmosphere in a completely different way. And what's interesting is that once you've done that, then you'll come back to your medium of choice, and you'll find that you have picked up some new skills that you can apply to your medium of choice. And it's sort of an eye-opener, and you'll realize, oh my goodness, I can do things that it just wouldn't have occurred to me otherwise. So I really strongly encourage you to pick a medium that is really very different, relatable, but very different to the one that you're used to using every day, and see if it doesn't go a long way in improving the technique that you use all the time. So I think that's about it. I'll let you finish watching in silence, and you might can put on some music and listen to that. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.